So, welcome to this conversation then. Didn't know what to call it. Book launch webinar. We did a launch of the book, didn't we? Where social workers joined and we talked about improving our confidence in these kinds of conversations, but we didn't have that recorded. And we know that people wanted to hear that conversation. So we've just set up this conversation between us. So if we both introduce ourselves to start with, Deirdre, then we can get into conversation, if that's all right. So the conversation is all about the book, which is called When There Are Few Words, with a very long subtitle of exploring some of the questions that might arise for you or someone close to you at the end of life. So we're going to have that conversation about the book and talk about the book and the conversations that it can lead to. So, if we just introduce ourselves to start off with, there is a picture of me with my lovely dog Pumpkin. Probably people will know me because you're on my YouTube channel, but my name is Siobhan McLean. I've been a social worker for 35 years. I have absolutely no experience in palliative care. To be honest, it's probably one of the only areas that I've never worked in professionally. I think certainly back in the day when I qualified, everything was generic. So you kind of worked in lots of different areas, but I have never worked with somebody at end of life. So very little experience. And so meeting Deirdre has been really, I've learned such a lot from Deirdre, and I hope you will too in this conversation. So, Deirdre, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, and hello, and thanks, Siobhan, for hosting this conversation. I'm a social worker as well, also for 35 years. And for the last 17 years or so, I have specialised in palliative and end of life care. So the first 7 years of the last 17 was in a hospice that's local to me here in the north of Ireland in Newry. So worked there as a social worker for 7 years, and then the local, what you would know as a local authority, but the statutory services here were developing their specialist palliative care teams to become more multidisciplinary, and I got the post of the social worker on that team, along with physios, OTs, pharmacy more recently. Um, the medics and the nurses, of course, also a dietitian. So that has been the focus of my work for the last, as I say, 17 years, and real heart work for me.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm. I think it really comes through as well, even in the way you talk and the way that you present yourself, actually, just that
Uh,
very gentle,
mm,
even I think that really does come through, the gentleness and the calmness always. So the conversation that we had was really, it was a launch of the book, wasn't it? But we had a whole conversation around the book, and we've had so many people contact us wanting to hear the conversation. So we're doing it again, really, for this purpose. But in terms of introducing the book, there is the front cover of the book. I don't know, one of the things I would like to say about the book, just looking at the cover there, is all of the photographs are. I said to you, shall we get a photographer? Shall we, get some artwork done? And you insisted, didn't you, on all of the photos being ordinary photos that you'd taken, or a couple, I think, of your friends have taken. Um, and then you said to me, as we were going through it, you said, but, dying is a part of life and it's just an ordinary thing. And the photos should just be ordinary photos. And that really struck me,
mm,
that even just the photos and how you wanted the book to be very ordinary,
mm.
very part of. Do you remember that
Acceptable. I
conversation?
do. I remember it well because there is something about, I suppose for any of us who are facing into this time with someone who's important to us, someone who's close for us, there's nothing ordinary about it because it is such a critical time in our lives and just such a painful time. But also because, moving toward end of life is part and parcel of what will be for all of us our life journey because we are all mortal. So the book needed to be accessible so that people could relate um, relate to that. So, as you say, the photographs aren't staged. They
Mm,
are, and mostly photographs of nature. And the other thing, just to continue about the pictures in the book, was do you remember, Siobhan, we were saying because of the gravity of the content of the book, which is about some of these questions that can come up for people or someone close to someone who's at the end of life. The photographs I was hoping would be a source of solace for them,
mm,
something soothing, just to help hold them
mm,
in the tenderness of this time for them. Because
mm,
as I say, the content is it's grave, it's living and dying, it's that heart core of all of us. So we need to have something that soothes us.
mm,
And also then the reflections I felt it was important for people to have something more that spoke to them in a different way, that they could
mm.
access the information in a different way. So I wrote a reflection at the end of each of the chapters too on that particular topic.
Mm, mm. And so I suppose this is the point really where people are already listening to the conversation. They've already seen the front slide, so they know something of what we're going to be talking about. But really just that sort of warning to people to take good care of themselves whilst listening to this conversation and being aware of some of the things that might arise for them, really, in the conversations about this area. So tell us a little bit about why you wrote this book.
Mm,
We've already heard 17 years worth of experience. And I always think social workers develop so much practice wisdom in their careers, and yet we don't share it.
mm,
And I think sometimes, these are not our stories to share. So we can't share our experience of working with people because they're not our stories. So how do we share that practice wisdom
mm,
that we grow? And I think that's something that you've done so brilliantly in the
mm.
book.
Thank you. The over the course of my work in direct practice with people, where I would go in as the specialist palliative care social worker to someone's home, into the heart of their family, at a time that is just so painful for people.
Mm,
And I would have noticed the questions that people would have asked of me, the person themselves who found themselves at end of life, or those who were caring for them. And some of the same questions tended to come up for people. And hmm, it had sat with me for a long time, the fact that the vast majority of us have very little contact with health and social care generally, never mind even fewer who have contact with specialist palliative care services. So I was thinking of my neighbours, friends, extended family members, um, where most of us live out our lives in the heart of our own communities. And, if we're fortunate enough to be able to live out our lives in our own homes and to die there. And I was troubled, I suppose, by the fact that who do these people ask questions? Who do they ask for information?
mm,
Or a wee bit of guidance. Where do they get that wee bit of guidance to help them navigate this time so that they can live through it as well as is possible? And for that reason, then last year, I took some sabbatical time, and I thought this is my opportunity now to write a book that might offer to people like that, neighbours, extended family members, people in our community, to offer them a wee bit of guidance and to address some of those questions that I found came up for people. And I know you're going to show what the questions we cover are. So, a wee bit of guidance by invitation that people could consider. Really, the purpose, as I say, to help people navigate that time as best they can, to have the information they need that might be helpful. And also, what I am absolutely convinced about is if we can live this time as well as possible, difficult and challenging and painful as it is, it can actually help us in our grieving experience
mm,
because we can maybe have more confidence that we did our very best, first of all, or that we had some conversations with the person that we were caring for who was coming to end of life. So some of the regret that can be around for people on into bereavement or grief after someone has died can be allayed
Mm.
because they, as I say, they're a wee bit more confident that, well, actually, I did have that conversation with the person. So that was my purpose,
Mm.
as I say, to offer a wee bit of guidance and also reassurance for people that, there's no right way very often. There's no right way to respond to someone's inquiries. But sometimes there's a way that does least harm at the very best, and more than that, that actually does a lot of good for the person.
Mm. Mm. Yes. And I do think it's such an interesting book on that angle. You think about you wrote it for people who don't have contact with health and social services, and maybe this is where maybe there's such a big crossover in this area between our professional self and our personal self, which I talk about a lot, because I think also as a professional, I was reading it on so many different levels,
Yeah. Mm.
when I could read it as um, my parents are aging, they're not end of life, but they're aging. And I was reading it in terms of thinking that through and what I might do as a daughter and so on. But I was also thinking about it as a professional, thinking, oh, that would be so helpful if somebody asked me that question to know some of that information. So it's layered. So even though you wrote it with a particular purpose and audience in mind. I think it has so many different purposes.
Mm.
I was just talking to you a short while ago, wasn't I, about a friend of mine who'd applied for a palliative care role, and she read this book as part of that preparation and found it really helpful at
Ah.
tuning into that area of practice. So it is very, I think, interesting when we write a book, we write it for a particular reason, but it has so many other layers to it, doesn't it, often? And as does social work,
Mm.
we're
Mm.
so it's so layered, really, our practice, isn't it? So I remember talking to you right at the beginning and whole thinking about the process of the book and so on. I published the book and I don't publish anybody else's books, so that's very unusual for me. Um, but I remember us having conversations and we got flip charts out and we listed loads of things, and there were so many. You started from the basis of what questions have people asked of me as a palliative
Yeah.
care worker, and we had so many, and then you brought them all down into some of the main questions or
Mm.
where those might come from. And so I think we've 3 slides actually here that list the questions. I don't know if you want to talk through just some of the questions and why you included those, why those were really important in the book. But I think you were saying earlier about we talked about the photographs, you talked about the reflections. I think it's important that people know that each question is almost like a chapter, isn't it, in the book?
Mm.
We don't
Mm.
call them chapters. Some of the responses you have around the questions are longer, some are shorter. You provide lots of information and guidance linking to other resources. So there's the question, there's the narrative explanation as to how you almost explain why are people asking this question, what might be the answer to the question, how might you address the question. There's lots of different things for each question. And then there's a summary for most of the questions,
Mm.
isn't there, summarizing the points. And then there's a reflection,
A picture and
a
yeah.
picture and a reflection for each one. So it's a very unique book. I've never known a book like that, and it kind of just grew, didn't it? As we didn't have a plan, here's what it will look like. It
Mm.
just grew, didn't it, as it
Mm.
was going
Mm.
along. So,
Yeah.
so I don't know if you wanted to talk through or say these are the questions, or even just read out the questions that are in the book. I don't know.
Yes, excuse me. I can do that. I also want to say, Siobhan, just that piece, and it is around purpose and also why it might be important to take time to consider some of these questions, which is, and I mentioned this in the book, about those two key moments in our lives. Um, that moment where for all of us we drew our first breath, and then that other moment that will come for all of us where we draw our last breath. And when you think of all of the preparation and planning that goes in around that expectant new baby is arriving, all of the plans, all of the readiness that happens around that, and then how little we actually do or have available to us for that last moment, which is so critical for us. So for me, it was important to think then about responding to people's inquiries or questions or concerns or fears in a way that offered reassurance to them, but also was honest enough to be able to allow them do whatever they needed to do in relation to, if I can use the phrase, dying well.
Mm.
So, for example, if someone asked a question and you can see it like the second question there, or even the first question, take it, do we have to tell them? So that was a question very often that would have come to me from a carer or a family member saying, we're afraid of saying to this person that we're caring for that they are, they are moving closer to end of life. We don't want it because we're afraid they'll lose hope. We're afraid they'll become depressed and so on. And what I would be suggesting in response to that is if we think, well, first of all, we don't want to collude with withholding information from anyone. So if someone wants information, I think it's absolutely appropriate and respectful of their right to give them the information that they're seeking. That's the first thing. But equally, I would caution that we don't force information on people. And that can be overwhelming and cruel. So we won't be forcing that. But if someone asks me that question, my suggestion for a response would be to consider if the person has the information, the truth about how they are and where they are in regard to their medical status, it provides them then not only with that information, but also with the opportunity to, for example, people talk about getting their affairs in order.
Mm.
Um, Maybe if there are concerns or spiritual concerns for people, maybe speaking to a priest or a minister to have that conversation. For some people, they may take the time then to prepare their own funeral liturgy or to write a will. So you can see that the while the person who is asking me this question, do we have to tell them, are so well intentioned. They're doing it for the very best reasons. But if we think just a wee bit, and we don't want to cause distress to anyone. So if we think about what a truthful answer to that question provides the person, that is such a gift to them at what is already a very difficult time of
Mm.
life.
Mm.
So in responding to that question, I cover that,
Mm.
explaining to people what might be going on, and I do it for each of the questions. The
Mm.
second question then that I have been asked, both professionally as a specialist palliative care social worker, but also personally, more recently, am I dying? And that is a difficult question. And I think for a lot of us have lost a vocabulary around
Mm.
or an ease around speaking about dying and death. So if someone asks us that question, because we are caring, because we care for this person, we our tendency is to rush in to reassure, not at all, you're doing great, and you know, um, you'll be grand, and so they kind of rush in with this whole, you know, hurried response to reassure and to kind of suppress that inquiry. For, as I say, really well-intentioned reasons, part of which is our own discomfort.
Mm.
I, as the listener, the one who has been asked, my own discomfort and fear around it, I feel I don't know. But equally not wanting to upset the person. Whereas, in fact, as I say, given accurate information to that person, or at least pausing long enough before the reassurance, pausing long enough to allow a wee bit more exploration around what has brought the person to ask this question. And some people would say that people know themselves how they're doing. And what can happen within a family context or in very close relationships is that there's a kind of an unspoken agreement not to mention what is going on. So I, as a spouse or a daughter or a mother or a sister or a very close friend, won't mention it because I don't want to upset this person. The person doesn't want to mention it to me because it would be
Mm.
tearful and emotional and so on. So people are tiptoeing around what is very often evident in the middle of their home without ever speaking about it.
Mm.
And then the moment of death can come as a surprise and a shock to some people without there ever have been without there ever having been conversations.
Mm.
But I think it's also important, Siobhan, to say that some people that we are caring for, some of us, will never ask the questions. We don't want to know the information. We don't want to have these conversations for whatever reason. And there is a plethora of reasons. And some of us will live through that time without ever articulating the fact that I know I'm dying or I wonder, am I dying? And that is all right too.
Mm.
It's not
Mm.
everybody's way.
Mm.
So just to be mindful of that, I remember some people, some family members would have said to me, asked me, have they talked about dying? Have they said anything you need to be saying to the
Mm.
person? And I would be reassured and saying, no, it's person led. Let the person lead the conversation. Let them decide when they've had enough. Let them come back to the conversation and so on. My responsibility is, and any of us as carers or close friends, the best we can do is to be willing to offer the opportunity to the person to ask these questions and to explore the responses.
Mm.
That's that's
Mm.
all we need to do is
Mm.
to create sufficient space and emotional safety for the person to be able to ask and to be able to cry.
Mm.
Um,
I think that was one of the things that really struck me when I was reading it was on both those counts. You were talking earlier about the preparation that we put into birth, but the lack of preparation when we're talking about the final breath. And reading the book really made me think that particular question because I was thinking, gosh, if somebody asked that of me, I know I would jump in. No, don't be silly. Of course you're not. Where actually I think if you pause and say, maybe what brings you to ask that question, or some of the things, some of the advice that you give in the book, I was thinking then people often asking that question, people already know the answer. But they're maybe asking you that question to see, are you someone who's safe to have this conversation with? Are you, I think the words you use, are you fit for the conversation? Are you ready? Can you help me through this time?
Mhm.
And it really helped me to think about that and to think about if somebody asks me that question, it's not about really them asking the question. It is really about I know this and I'm actually asking you for some support and space and time to think about it and talk about it. So I found that it just really, really helpful. And obviously we can't go through all of the advice that you give in relation to all of the
Yeah,
questions
yeah,
there in the way that we've just done that. But I think for me, in thinking about all of these questions and when I was reading through the book and we were talking about it, I think what I found really helpful was you could take some of it away from thinking about conversations at end of life to just thinking about any really difficult, courageous conversations.
yeah,
That whole response of what brings you to ask that question of me is just such a good way of giving the person that space to explore and giving you more information and more space and time to think about your response, just lot. And I think at each point, things like how might I spend time with someone who is dying, I think is so important for family members to think about. And what you were saying earlier about grief and maybe regret afterwards about what we didn't do with the person. Maybe I know because of my just my personality, how I am, I know I'll be walking around cleaning up after everything. And that's not, later I might regret that, I'll be cleaning work surfaces instead of spending time sitting with people. And I really, the question you asked there, do I have to be there at the end? That really gave me a lot of thinking. It really prompted me into thinking about my thoughts about that. And actually, the whole book has prompted me to think about when my parents pass and has made me have conversations with my own children, adult children, but about my wishes. And so I think, as you said, we don't have a vocabulary, we don't have these conversations. And I think, as a result of working through the book and reading the book, much more confident about having these kinds of conversations later. I went to a funeral yesterday. I felt like I was much more able to speak to the family members that were there and offer condolences in ways where previously I think I would have just been tongue-tied and not known what to say. So I think, working through all of these is helpful just on a human level,
Yeah.
really, because
Yeah.
this is about human
Absolutely.
experience.
And and also, Siobhan, just what you're saying about you would be cleaning because that is your way. I think it is. That's okay. That is absolutely okay. I'm thinking of my own family. I'm one of six
Mm,
children, all adults, children. Um, I've one sister and four brothers, and our personalities are very different. So how each of us managed that time when, first of all, my father died about 6, 7 years ago, and then my mother died 3 years ago. How each of us managed that time was in keeping with our personalities, in keeping with how we always managed.
mm,
Um, and that is okay. So it's not, this isn't about trying to force people to become therapists.
mm,
Absolutely not. It is simply to give a wee bit of guidance and some suggestions, and it's all by way of invitation to
mm,
consider that any of us, even while we're cleaning the work surfaces, these conversations can happen.
mm,
And I think one of the reflections in the book, Siobhan, is about that, the question, am I dying, drifting across a kitchen floor?
mm,
Because that's sometimes the questions aren't coming like in a therapeutic situation where we're sitting across from the person. Sometimes they will come while someone's sitting in the chair in the kitchen or at the kitchen table and almost like a throwaway remark.
mm,
So I will respond. And also, some of us are very uncomfortable with the intensity of an eye to eye
mm,
conversation. It's too intense. It's a
mm,
wee bit. So we're much better. You know how if you're trying to speak to teenagers, people would recommend that, really good conversations can happen in the car because there isn't that intensity of gaze, where both can take a break from to say whatever it is, the nature of the conversation they're having. And so with these questions. So it's not to force you to become
mm,
something you're not,
mm,
but it's to help you in your
mm,
way to do your very best.
mm, mm,
I think just to mention another question that I thought was important to cover, Siobhan, was the one on conflict.
mm,
You know, someone dying in a family is already a very painful time, as I say. It's a challenging time for people. But and family members tend together. But when there is conflict or estrangement within the family, that just intensifies and amplifies the conflict or the dis-ease. And it's a potentially, I would consider, it's a potentially dangerous time for family relationships because people are tired if they've been sitting with the person or have been very involved in their care. Maybe their sleep may not be as good as it was because just of the reality of the this dying time. mightn't be eating so well. So people are already out of sorts emotionally and maybe physically. So the risk to mishear, to misspeak, to misunderstand, and to confirm, how awful that other person is to me. So I thought it was really important to take time with that question. And it was actually one of the questions that I found very difficult to write, probably the most difficult, because I was trying to hold on this continuum of, say, for example, you and I not getting on that great, or being jealous of each other as sisters, to someone who was actually harmed by the person who was dying, who suffered trauma. So to try and respond to that in a way that held and honored the experience right across that continuum, I found, I suppose I felt a real responsibility to do that well.
Mm.
Um, because that is a difficult time for us. And I do offer some suggestions around that, some guidance about how to manage that. And also, what I hope people experience is permission, maybe not to expose themselves
Mm.
to where there is very serious conflict. You
Mm.
don't need to do that. So, as I say, just personally and professionally, that was probably the toughest question for
Mm.
me to write.
Mm.
I would hope, as you said earlier, that maybe some of the guidance in that is transferable to other difficult situations.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. That's interesting. I don't think we've had that conversation before about that being the most difficult question. So
Yeah.
that's really interesting. And then we go to some more of the, I think these are the much more detailed
Clinical.
questions, aren't they?
Yeah.
The more, yeah, kind of clinical questions, as you say. And I think in conversation with me before, you've said some of them, for example, why can't they eat or drink? You as a social worker wouldn't necessarily have answered that. You'd have worked for someone else in the multidisciplinary team. So you'd have, reassured
Speech
the
and language.
person
Yeah.
and passed that over. So, but questions like, did the doctors tell me? Or it really when communication isn't clear. And I think that often happens because people are not necessarily hearing, but also because actually some clinicians are not very good at communicating some of this material. Some of these conversations aren't happening. Why are they talking about resuscitation? How will I know? What can I expect? I think that can be a really important question for people to understand. And the one I say that really has helped me in conversations, what about when my time comes? How can I try and get what I would like? Because you're learning about the experience of dying. So, they're almost, it's the second part of the book, really, isn't it? They almost do sit quite separately. You've got these very social based, family, relationship based questions, but then you've got these much more clinical type questions. So,
Yes, and but the response is according to our capacity, really, in relation to these. So, just as you say, when I was working in the multidisciplinary team, where and I suppose in my culture and in for a lot of us in our culture, food is central.
mm,
The gatherings around celebrations, every occasion actually can revolve around food and eating. So eating and drinking for a lot of us becomes associated very closely with care
mm,
and a demonstration of my regard for you. So I prepare, like you did last night, you prepared a lovely dinner for us. And that is, I felt cared for. I felt
mm,
well regarded. So when
mm,
someone, because of a medical deterioration or clinical deterioration, their capacity or their ability to actually swallow, eat, or drink is diminished to a point where, as for example, a speech and language therapist or a doctor might say that the risk, that people are eating now at risk because the risk of choking is high. So people can interpret that as not being allowed to provide the natural, normal care
mm,
of preparing something tasty for the person or giving them a drink. So it's just to explain to people in a bit more detail what's going on there, what the risks are, but always, trying to be person-led
mm,
and to make decisions with full information,
mm,
whatever the decisions are, um, that at least I have the information about the risks and benefits of what I'm doing.
mm,
In regard to the question on the do not attempt a resuscitation, that I have heard people say so often to me with great distress about the shock they got when a doctor broached this question with them. Very often, just outside an accident and emergency ward, out into a corridor where a doctor might say to a relative about the person in accident and emergency, have they ever spoken about do not resuscitate? Just the shock of that, or discover that a DNA CPR has been written into their medical notes. And a lot of it is, in my experience, a misunderstanding of what that conversation is about and what that means. So I thought it really important to alleviate some of the distress around that and just to explain it. I should include it in the book for
mm,
people so that they're not shocked and horrified or misunderstanding what it actually means, that
mm,
people are being written off,
mm,
and that no attempt to treat them or comfort them will be offered. It's
mm,
certainly not that.
mm,
Um, how will I know? What can I expect? Um, and this is Siobhan. Normally, I wouldn't have described that journey for people, because in the multidisciplinary team, I was fortunate enough to work alongside specialist nurses, and also our palliative doctors. And I would recommend to people that they could say, speak to your GP about that, because they're in a position not to give you a definite descriptive blow by blow of what will happen to this person, but they are able to look at, all of the issues, medical issues that are around for the person, how they are clinically and typically what might happen. And then coming towards very end of life in the last days and hours, there tends to be certain symptoms that you can see, certain things that you
mm,
can notice that are different. And I do describe those in the book. And also to say to people who are listening to us, thankfully, there are so many good resources that do that descriptive piece so well. Most of the hospices would have material, and I do link to that at the back of the book, as you said earlier, and give information equally about the Do Not Resuscitate. Resuscitation UK has fantastic material if people need to read more, and I would recommend that they do. Um, so it's just that people have the information that they need or know
mm,
where to get it
mm,
so that they can respond in the most helpful way to the person who
mm,
is asking the questions.
mm,
And then, of course, what about when my time comes? That is known in health and social care as advanced care planning.
mm.
And I've done a lot of work on that, so I thought it was really important to include it in the book. But equally, how many times have you heard someone at a funeral or at a wake saying, "Well, when it's me, I don't want that," or "Well, would like that," or "That was a good send off. I would like something like that." But people never actually take the time to sit and think, "What would I like?" And who am I going to tell what I would like? So
Mm,
those conversations that you've had with your adult daughters, and
mm,
also some of the conversations you've had with your parents.
mm,
So they are important.
mm,
The other thing, I don't know if I've said this, Siobhan, but not only for me working in a multidisciplinary team where I would have felt maybe I'm not the best person to respond to this. Equally for the people who are reading the book or any of you who are listening, you may not be the best person. You may not feel able to respond. And it is absolutely appropriate for you to say, I hear your question. I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer it for you or to respond to it, but let me find out who can, and I'll come back to you, and then come back to the person. That is absolutely fine because, in truth, Siobhan, it isn't possible for all of us to be able to respond.
Mm,
Um, but it is absolutely reasonable to say, let me get someone,
mm,
let me find someone who can maybe help you with this.
mm,
So, for example, one of the questions for people, it's not medical at all, it's spiritual, concerned about what happens after I die. There's very few of us would feel comfortable or confident about speaking about our faith or our understanding of what happens after we die. But we have priests and ministers and spiritual guides for certainly the major faith religions, and also then for those humanists, for example, who are able to speak with their understanding of spirituality and what happens after death. So it's all right to be able to signpost people if you don't feel comfortable or able with any of these conversations.
mm,
And also, for some of us, if they are tender conversations, the chances are I will cry, I will become upset. That's all right. That is all right. And sometimes for you and the person you're caring for or that you're close to, sometimes the release of tears together is therapy itself because it allows me an opportunity to say maybe, thank you for who you've been in my life. Thank you for what you did for me. I love you. I may not have said that to you before. So those moments provide opportunities to say some really powerful things. And imagine that that is what you're hearing as you move toward your last breath.
mm,
Thank you. I'm sorry. Forgive me. Imagine hearing that. That is so powerful
mm.
to allay the spirit and to just warm the heart.
Mm, mm. And I know in the book you do talk about the kinds of things we might want to say to people as they're
Mm.
going. You've got some other questions that are maybe slightly more practical questions
Shorter.
as well, as shorter questions at the book, aren't they? I think actually you do that as a separate chapter of other questions that might arise. And some of the examples are things like how do I manage all the visitors? How do I take care of myself? What do I say to children? You have something quite specific in there about that, don't you? And what happens now when the person you've cared for has died? So there's lots of quite practical, more shorter questions covered in the book. But I think really what the book is doing is helping us to think about these conversations and helping us, um, even if, I mean, if you know that there is a time coming or you're in that time, I can see that this book would be good to dip in and out of. But for me, there's no urgency of time. But I still found it a fascinating, really fascinating read. And I think one of the things that I wrote a little piece at the very end, didn't I? But one of the things that I wrote was I do a lot of work on kindness. I talk a lot about kindness, and in my training, one of the things it made me change a slide because one of my slides had always said, things can be nice, but only people can be kind. And I've changed it because I think this is a kind book. I think it really made me think about what I was saying about kindness, because there's a lot of gentleness in this book and there's a lot of kindness, and that's what people are saying. There's lots of reviews here. You've had a number of book reviews, lots of things being said about the book on social media. And I think we did put together a couple of slides with a couple of the pictures from the book alongside of them. I think these were from Amazon, weren't they? We don't know where they came from.
Mm.
But this one, having been through the process of losing a loved one a few times, I was acutely aware of how ill prepared I was. With the intention of being better prepared in the future, I read this book. It's a beautiful book. I love that. It is a beautiful book.
Mm.
It in a highly empathic way, the author guides the reader with kindness, compassion, and wisdom. Reading this reminded me of the truly authentic voice of a loving parent or grandparent imparting wisdom to someone they love who is in great distress. Isn't that a lovely way of
Mm.
describing the book? And it did feel like that. It felt like I was reading this book and I was being wrapped in some warmth as I read it, for me. And then the review goes on to say, dying is a great mystery, in part because we rarely speak about it. Reading this book helps equip the reader to be better prepared and to feel less alone when faced with supporting a loved one through this process. I mean, you must have been delighted, to see that
Yeah.
as a
I
review.
suppose it certainly was my hope that people would experience it as gentle.
Mm,
Um, on a practical note, in relation to the book, Siobhan, some of the conversations we had about its layout, do you remember? We talked about the size of the print text actually needed to be a certain size because when we're stressed or under pressure, it's more difficult for us to read or to concentrate. Also, it's deliberately short, so we covered these number of questions because people don't have time to sit and wade through a whole lot of text if they need information quickly, which can happen at this time of life. And also, there was another piece about that. Oh, yes, that we did the key messages or the summary piece so that if I was asked a question and I needed a quick reference to the main points, rather than, read through paragraphs, I was able to go to a page. So we were trying to think of what would be, what are people able for and how can we respond to that?
mm,
Ideally, our hope is to do an audio book because I think we can listen to that then and it lends itself to that.
mm,
We haven't done that yet, but it's certainly a part of our plan, but it's a bit further down the line. So even practically, we have tried to take care,
mm,
take
mm.
care.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And then another review. This book, which is beautifully and sensitively written, deals with the issues you never want to focus on, particularly as we rarely contemplate or discuss dying and death. The book gently takes the reader through the issues that arise when a loved one is dying and offers a framework for conversations that allow the loved ones to express their views on how and where they want to die and their wishes about how this is to be handled. In my case, it's led to important conversations with my daughter about my thoughts on dying and death when it comes, which my daughter found very helpful as we've never before discussed these issues. That was also my
Yeah, yeah,
experience of working through the book. So, a very valuable and necessary book that you can dip into as various questions and issues are dealt with in each chapter. The tone of the book is very gentle and it covers all of the issues that are likely to arise in the event that a loved one is diagnosed with a terminal illness. And it also offers a space for you to consider your own dying and death and to initiate conversations with your family and friends about this. Actually, that's just made me think about one of the things that we did in the book is there's a few pages where it says for your own notes, so
mm,
people can write some notes. And we thought about maybe they'd write some questions they wanted to ask of somebody, but maybe it's something where people could also write some of their own thoughts about
absolutely.
their
Yeah,
own
absolutely.
advanced care planning, I
Yeah,
suppose, in a way.
yeah.
So I think they were the slides that we prepared to talk things through, and there may be something that you feel we've not shared or that you'd want to share. I don't know. There's plenty more. We're not rushing through this. There's
Yeah.
plenty of space. But we know that people do ask us, where can you get the book from? And so all the usual places. Um, Amazon Prime, we checked this morning because the price changes all the time, but it was £11 and four pence this morning.
Mm.
We don't know why. But you can get it from Amazon. Hive Books. I love Hive Books. I don't really use Amazon. I would use Hive Books as a social worker. I think it's a more ethical bookseller. Same no postage charges, but it's £12 there, which is the RRP, isn't it? Or you can get it direct from my website, but I charge postage on top. I
Mm.
think it comes out
Or
about £16, doesn't it, with the postage, I think.
or bookshops.
Any bookshop,
It's in,
yeah,
and if they don't have it in stock, they will order it from the distributor. So
yeah.
it is available to people. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Let's hope that some libraries might get it as well. I mean, if people are going into libraries and asking for it enough, maybe
Yeah.
libraries might start to stock the book too.
It's really just that our hope, Siobhan, is when we did it, is that the person who needs it will be able to find it.
Yeah, Yeah, and there is an e-version of it actually, which we've not
Yeah,
mentioned, so
yeah.
people can get it electronically.
Mm,
I mean, I still love to hold a book in my
yeah.
hands,
And
but
especially if you want
yeah,
to
if you want to
write
put your
or
own
see the
notes,
photograph, yeah.
yeah, yeah. But there is
Yeah.
an e-version, and the
Yes,
photos
yeah.
are in the
That's what
e-version too.
it looks
So
like. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
It's that size, so it's
Oh yeah, you can see the size. You can see my post-it notes
well,
in it.
there's that same photograph that
Oh,
you have on one of your slides.
yeah.
So it's yeah,
Yeah.
just to give you an idea, the
Not too
size of
much
it.
text on the
Mm.
page either, I think. And I think, you bought all that great wisdom, and maybe I feel like maybe what I bought was something of, thinking about
Well, you know how to
the
write books.
well, no, but more maybe I bought something about the layout and how it
Uh,
could be
yeah,
put together.
absolutely.
Maybe that's what I was
And
able
so
to
much
bring.
more.
So, so thank you very much for that conversation,
Well, thank
Deirdre.
you, Siobhan.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Yeah, and I hope it has landed softly with people.
Mm.
And maybe if someone is listening to it or has just watched it, just take care of yourself as you go because it is, I mean, we are covering sensitive subjects. It can leave our hearts a wee bit tender. So do something nice for yourself now, having watched this or listened to it, and do be gentle. Be very gentle.
Thank you.
Mm,
I know because you often say to me when we say goodbye, go gently. And I've
yeah.
started to say that to people now. So I'll pick that up from you. So
Brilliant. Thank
thank
you.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.